In this video, we are going to learn how to implement retry logic in Angular. The idea is the following. We have an Angular application and also we have a backend, which in our case is a web API in ASP.NET Core. Although it doesn't matter because what we will learn in this video will apply if you use a backend on Python, Go, Node.js, or whatever. But the scenario is the following. We want to execute an HTTP request from our Angular application to our backend. But sometimes communication can fail, and therefore we want to make sure that there is some retry logic so that if the communication fails, we retry 3 times before giving up. And after 3 retries, and so that the user doesn't have to wait forever, we give a heads up to the user and then give them the choice to keep retrying. So that is what we're going to try in this video. Let's see an example. Let's see that we have here this Angular application and we have this data that comes from our backend. If I press F5, you're going to see that everything works. Now, that is because my web API is up and running. If I close it and then I refresh, you are going to see that it only says loading, but nothing happens. And even if I come here to Visual Studio and run my application one more time, my web API, now it is up again. And I come here, again, nothing is happening. Even though the web API is up again, the Angular application doesn't know that. So the user has to come here and then press F5 so that it can start over, and now the communication works, but that is a very bad user experience. We want this to happen automatically. So that is what we're going to do in this video. But before that, if you want to learn more about how to build Angular and ASP.NET Core applications, buy my Udemy course today. In this course, we start from scratch learning Angular and ASP.NET Core, and finally, we deploy our application in the cloud. Link with a discount to this course in the description of this video. Alright, so back to the tutorial. Let's come here to Visual Studio Code and let's see that we have this simple app component which has some data here, which is a weather forecast object which have this data. And then let's come back here and let's see that we have this API service from which we do the HTTP GET request. We are going to see that in just a minute. Let's see that here we have an onInit in which we execute this load data function in which we use the API service. We do get data, we subscribe to the observable, and then we say this weather forecast equal to data. Then let's come here to the HTML, and in here you can see that we have if the data is undefined, then we're going to display loading. Otherwise, we display this table and just iterate over the data. Again, pretty simple stuff. Now, let's come here and let's see that we're using this API service. And let's see that in here, we are using the HTTP client so that we can do a GET request to our web API, which is in this URL that we have here. So, how can we do retry logic? Let me first close my console so that I can stop running my web API. And now, let's do the following. I want to say here pipe. I do pipe because I want to execute a few functions. The first one is retry. With retry, as its name implies, we can do some retry logic. Let me pass an object. Here I will say count because how many times I want to retry? It is not going to be forever, so I will say 3. I want to retry 3 times. And then I am going to pass a delay function, which is a function that allows me to determine programmatically if I want to retry or not. Let me say here, error and retry count. As you may imagine, error is the error object that we get from this GET request, and retry count is the retry count. So, the first thing that I want to ask is, should we retry? It depends, because for example, if from the web API we got back a 404, it doesn't make sense for us to retry. We want to retry if there was an error in communication, if there was a 500, 501 or so error, and so forth. So let me do the following. I will say should retry if the error status is equal to 0, which means that there was some sort of communication error, or the status code is 500 or more, then we're going to retry. Otherwise, we're going to throw an error. And let me bring this from RxJS. We're going to throw if should retry is false. Now, optionally, I can say console1 retry number so that we can see on the console in which retry we are in. Now, how much time do we want to wait before retrying again? In my case, it's going to be 1 second. So let me say return timer 1000 milliseconds. Let me import this. And now, after this retry, we're going to say catch error. This is in the case that we do the 3 retries and none of them works. In this case, we want to execute this function. We're going to have here the error, and we're going to say console error, final error when retrying, and here we put in the console the error object, and finally we throw the error. So let's see how we're doing. With this, we have a difference in our application. We're not finished yet, but we have improved. So let me save here. Let's come here. Remember that our application is down, our web API is down. So we get back this loading here, and we can see that we have retry 1, retry 2, and finally we're going to have retry 3. And then okay, we get back the final error. Let me refresh one more time. Let's see that again, we have an error here, but now let me come here, Control F5 to run my web API, and let's come here and oh, look at that. The application is working. The application was able to resend an HTTP request, and now that the web API was up, then we got back a successful response. Excellent. But as we saw, if we shut down the API one more time, you can see that if we try 3 times and the web API is still down, then we're not going to display anything to the user. We have an error here, but this still says loading. This is a bad user experience. I want to display a message to the user here in the app component. So what I will do is that I will come here and I will create some state. I will say error equal to false. By default, error will be false. And then I want to pass here, instead of a simple function, I want to pass an object. I want to say next, which is the function that will execute if the HTTP request is successful. I will say this. Otherwise, I will say error. And then here I will say function this error equal to true. So if error is equal to true, then I want to display some custom UI here, which will say if error is true, there has been an error when loading the data. Button, click, retry, and retry. We have to implement this retry function, but first let me say here else, and let me remove this from here, and let me put this here. All right, and now let me put some indentation just so that this looks better. All right, this is better. Now let's implement this retry function, which is a pretty simple function. We're going to say retry here, and let me say this error false, and then this load data. So we're just going to repeat the process all over again. So let me save, Control save everything. Let's come back here. Let's wait the 3 retries. And as you can see now, we have the error message in place so that the user knows that there is something wrong. They can retry. So I can say retry one more time. Now we have loading. Now let me run my web API one more time. And let's see that now this is working again. So this is a better user experience than what we have before. Now our application is way more professional. It is more resilient because it takes into account the possibility of our web API being down. Thank you.